Abraham is the one who is recognized as the father of faith, lived an incredible journey marked by his obedience and trust in God. His story goes far beyond an ancient account. Your story is a perennial source of inspiration and wisdom for us all, regardless of the time in which we live. The call of Abraham is a landmark fundamental in the history of faith, an event that not only defined his journey but also imparted timeless lessons about obedience and trust in God. Let us delve deeper into this remarkable passage from Genesis 12:14. We are invited to reflect on the importance of listening and following the voice of God, even when it means leaving back the familiar and embark on known territories. The narrative begins with a direct command from God to Abraham, "Get out of your land, of your kindred, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." Genesis 12:1. This was not a simple suggestion but a clear and unequivocally God was calling Abraham for a journey of faith that would require significant sacrifices. God didn't just ask Abraham to leave out of your comfort zone but also promised to bless you abundantly and make it a source of blessing for all the nations. This promise was more than a simple guarantee of success, was an affirmation of the divine purpose in the life of Abraham and his role in the history of redemption. Abraham's response to this call is revelation of your faith and readiness to obey. The text does not report hesitation or questioning on the part of Abraham. Instead, he simply obeyed. Abraham went out as the Lord did to him ordered. Genesis 12:4. Here's the first big lesson. What can we extract from this passage? Importance of promptly complying with the voice of God even when not we completely understand your plan. Divine Abraham's obedience was a expression of his trust in God. I didn't need to understand all the details or have a detailed itinerary of what the waited in new earth. Your trust was firmly anchored in nature. God's faithful and sovereign Abraham trusted that if God was calling him, he would too, would provide, protect, and fulfill its promises. This lesson remains relevant for us today. We often face God's decisions and directions that seem challenging or unknowns. Can be difficult to let go of the familiar and the comfortable, especially when we don't fully understand where God is leading us. However, the story of Abraham reminds us that the obedience to the voice of God is the way for divine blessings and purposes. Greater. When reflecting on the call of Abraham, we are invited to examine our own hearts and dispositions. To obey God, are we ready to leave behind what is comfortable and familiar? When God calls us to moving forward in faith, do we trust in God's faithfulness to guide us and sustain in all circumstances? This challenges us to respond to these questions with a bold and obedient faith, recognizing that God's way, although it may seem unknown, it is always guided by your wisdom and love, infallible. The account of the promise of descendants of Abraham reveals one of the most highlights of the journey of faith. In that episode, despite the circumstances apparently impossible, Abraham demonstrated faith, true and unshakable in the promises of God. The narrative begins with God promising Abraham that his descendants would be numerous, comparable to the stars of the heaven. This promise was especially significant because Abraham and his wife, Sarah, were already elderly and she was sterile. Human point of view, possibility of having children seemed remote and impossible. However, Abraham did not allow the circumstances. The faith of Abraham discouraged their faith. In that context was not just a vague belief or optimism. Deep-rooted, it was a deep and firm in the faithfulness and power of God to fulfill his promises. Abraham did not was based on their own ability or in human possibilities. He trusted in the sovereign nature of God that is above all earthly limitations. The fact that Abraham and Sarah were elderly and sterile made the divine promise still more extraordinary. This highlighted that the fulfillment of this promise could only occur through an intervention divine. The faith of Abraham does not ignore the difficulties or impossibilities. Apparent to the contrary, she recognized these human limitations and yet chose to trust in the unlimited capacity of God to accomplish the impossible. This history reminds us that true faith don't be shaken by the circumstances, adverse or apparently impossible. On the contrary, it strengthens by recognizing that God is above all limitations and that his promises are safe and reliable. The faith that Abraham had teaches us that regardless of what we see around us, we must trust the promises, unshakable of God. This lesson has deep implications for our journey of faith. Today we often face situations that seem impossible to human eyes. We can come across challenges, struggles, and obstacles that make us question whether God's promises are real and achievable. However, the story of Abraham reminds us that the true faith is not based on what we see or we understand, but in nature, faithful and power of God. When we look at the promise, we are challenged to examine our own faith and trust in the promises of God. Do we trust himself when circumstances seem impossible? Did we choose believe in faithfulness and the power of God, regardless of what the eyes see? The fact encourages us to nurture a faith that transcends human limitations and stands firm in the certainty of promises divine. She reminds us that just like Abraham, we can trust a God who is able to accomplish the impossible and fulfill all his promises, no matter how challenging circumstances may. It all started when God made an extraordinary request to Abraham: sacrifice his own son Isaac as one holocaust. Imagine the whirlwind of emotions that Abraham must have felt when hear this order. Isaac was the son of promise, the long-awaited son that God had promised Abraham and Sarah in their velice. Abraham must have wondered, how could God ask for something so painful and apparently contradictory? However, the answer from Abraham reveals the depth of his faith. He did not hesitate to obey God himself faced with such a situation distressing. Abraham did not allow his emotions or questions prevented him from to trust in the sovereignty and goodness of God. He decided to move on, trusting that God had a greater plan, and that he could even resurrect Isaac if necessary. When climbing to mountain with Isaac, Abraham demonstrated a total and unshakable trust in God. He was willing to sacrifice what loved more by showing that his faith did not was based on circumstances favorable, but in God who is worthy of confidence in all situations. The culminating moment of this story is when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac and God intervened. He provided a lamb for the sacrifice, showing that he did not demanded the sacrifice of Isaac but wanted to test the faith and obedience of Abraham. This divine intervention does not only saved Isaac's life, but also confirmed God's faithfulness in keep your promises. This story challenges our understanding of faith and trust in God. She reminds us that even when we face situations painful and disconcerting, can we trust that God is in control and has a purpose greater. Abraham teaches us to trust in God completely, even when not we completely understand his reasons or plans. Our lives can be full of challenges and trials, but the story of Abraham encourages us to keep our faith firm, knowing that God is able to sustain and guide us in all circumstances. Just like Abraham, we can trust that God is worthy of our trust and that he is always working on our favor even when we can't see beyond of the difficulties of the moment. Another fact: Abraham's incredible story is a powerful demonstration of his concern for justice and its compassion for people. In this passage, God reveals to Abraham his plan to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to its extreme evil. What follows is a dialogue moving between Abraham and God, where Abraham intercedes on behalf of the cities, showing his deep concern for the justice and his compassion for the inhabitants. From these locations, Abraham begins his interception, questioning the justice of God will make you also perish the righteous with the wicked. Genesis 18:2. He asks a series of questions to God, gradually decreasing the number of fairness that would be necessary to Save cities from destruction. This dialogue reveals not only Abraham's courage in questioning God but also his deep compassion by the people who inhabited Sodom and Gomorrah. The heart of Abraham shines through in his words as he intercedes in favor of the cities far from you that do such a thing that you kill the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous may be like the wicked. Far from you will not do justice. Judge of all the earth. Genesis 18:25. He recognizes the sovereignty and justice of God at the same time as appeals for divine mercy. Dialogue between Abraham and God reveals the importance of justice and compassion in our lives. Christians, Abraham not only cares with his own salvation but also with the salvation of others. His intercession highlights the vital role that prayer and concern for the well-being of others has in our lives. Spiritual. This passage reminds us that, as Christians, we are called not only to seek justice but also to act with compassion and intercede for needs of others. The justice of Abraham was not just a question. Theory was a practical expression of his faith in God and your love for others. Furthermore, God's response to Abraham's intercession demonstrates his willingness to listen and respond to prayers of your servants righteous. Though the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed due to his wickedness, the intercession of Abraham highlights the transformative power of prayer and the importance of standing up in favor of justice and mercy. Inheritance of faith that we receive through Abraham as taught by the Apostle Paul, who emphasizes that those who are of faith are considered children of Abraham and inherit the promises made to him. Paul begins by citing the example of Abraham to show how faith has always been the means of relationship with God, as well as Abraham believed in God and it was imputed as justice. Galatians 3:6. He highlights that the faith of Abraham was based on one's own works or merits, but in trusting completely in God and in his promises. This faith was credited to Abraham as justice, showing that the relationship with God has always been based in faith. Then Paul makes a statement powerful over inheritance spiritual that we receive through faith in Christ. Know therefore that those who are of the faith are children of Abraham. Galatians 3:7. Here he explains that those who have faith in Christ are considered children, spiritual values of Abraham being part of the same spiritual lineage as he. This means that the promises to Abraham as the blessing and justification by faith are also inherited by those who also has faith in Christ. Paul continues his explanation, pointing to the universality of faith in God. Now the scriptures predicted that God should justify by faith to the Gentiles. First announced the gospel to Abraham, saying, all nations will be blessed. He highlights that faith is not an exclusivity of a given nation or group, but is accessible to all people regardless of their origin or social status. Finally, Paul reaffirms the importance of faith as the central element of the relationship with God. Lucky that those who are of faith are blessed. With the believer Abraham, Galatians 3:9, he emphasizes that the true blessing and justification come by faith, and those who have faith in Christ share the same blessing as Abraham received. This passage reminds us of importance of faith in our journey. Spiritual, our faith connects us to the great story of faith that began with Abraham and continues until today. She inspires us to live a life of trust in God and his promises, knowing that we are heirs of the same blessings and justification by faith that Abraham received. In addition, universality of faith reminds us that the salvation is not exclusive to one group select but accessible to all people who put their faith in Christ. This challenges us to share the gospel with everyone, carrying the message of hope and salvation all nations, just as was promised to Abraham. Your life is a powerful testimony of how faith in God can transform lives and shape the course of history. Your lessons about obedience, trust, justice, and intercession continue to resonate in our hearts today, challenging us to Live a life of authentic faith and trust in God's sovereign plan for our lives.